The question has come up, first of all, what exactly is a pod home and where did this idea come from? The history of the pod home is an evolution from the nap lounges of 1950s America and airports to the nap hotels of the 1950s and 60s United States, Japan, and most of Europe to the pod hotels of the 1980s Japan. Back in the mid 1970s, the Japanese economy started to explode. Japanese salarymen began working 12 to 20 hours a day. They would be too exhausted to go home, so they would take naps at their desks, often encouraged by their supervisors. Many even began faking naps just to impress the boss. At the end of the day, they'd be too exhausted to go home, so and if they had a big payday, they'd be too drunk to go. They'd be traveling 2, 3 hours on a train to and from, just not enough time. As early as the 1950s, U.S. airports started offering nap lounges because American businessmen were working roughly the same kind of hours. There was typically a chair in a dark or darker room, very much like the application scene in Men in Black, where you could take 15-minute to a half-hour nap before getting onto your next plane. In more modern nap lounges, they have sound canceling technology. Someone in Japan took this idea and just cranked it up a bit. Rather than a chair, you'd sit in a horribly uncomfortable position for your neck, you would lie down. Someone in Japan took this idea and just cranked it up a little bit. Rather than a chair that you would sit in, which is horrible on your neck, you'd lay down. The earliest example of this that I'm aware of, they took a pair of bathtubs, cut the end off of both, flipped one over, and somehow attached them together. If you go through our playlist, you'll see this particular hotel is actually mentioned. They talk about the missing, uh, uh, how the drain was never properly patched up and covered. In this, you could actually climb in and lay down for 2, 3 hours and get some real sleep. Get up, take a shower, go back the next day and do it all over again. When Friday came around, you take the train out a couple hours to your company housing and get 48 hours of real sleep. If it was a payday, you might not be sober enough to take the train home, and you could go right across the street to the Pod Hotel, climb in, and sleep it off. Somewhere around 1993 or so, I read a story and saw a photograph of one of these hotels, and I thought, oh my God, that's the perfect model for a homeless shelter. It's individualized, it's making it private and secure. There's even a door on the pods. Yes, it's communal toilets, sinks, and showers, but it was otherwise absolutely perfect. You could just climb in to your pod and go to sleep for 6 to 12 hours until the next day and go out and try to face the world again. I have to admit that I sat on the idea for a better part of a decade. I was working and raising my kids, and in short, I had my own problems. But it always sat in the back of my mind, just niggling away back there. In the intervening years, I interviewed for a civilian position at a National Guard armory that served as a homeless shelter. All they did there was take the partitions that the armory uses for special events, promotions, sometimes for training, and they set them up between the areas of about 4 to 6 army cots. Obviously, this is not ideal. During the interview, they had said that a couple months before they had to escort a gentleman out because he tried to sneak from the men's side to the women's side, causing several partitions to fall and waking everyone up. Later on, at a Salvation Army, I saw where they had used office partitions to separate small areas of 4 to 6 cots, which were slightly better than army cots, but still just cots. That's way better than the streets, but it's not proper. I also point I'd also point out as COVID came along, all of these people were kind of trapped in the same air. Remember, COVID was an airborne virus. A dirty little secret about COVID is that it did strike the homeless community a lot harder because they don't have the kind of protections and were already hurt by another plague that had broken out. Bubonic plague, of all things, had broken out a year and a half earlier. This got a little media attention, but mostly the citizen journalists like Tim Pool, who dedicated a 15-minute rant to the subject. Now you have these communal spaces where these people have to deal with whatever's around them. No separation, no barrier, nothing. A few years ago, some misfortune befell me, and all of a sudden, I did have the kind of time to think about that silly old idea I had about using pod hotels as homeless shelters. Whereas the armory and Salvation Army examples leave the residents exposed to whatever is in the environment, a pod is reasonably isolated for the most part. They can simply close their door to their pod. Pod home properly set up with forced air ventilation and filters, they'd be better protected from diseases in the air. If one of their neighbors comes home drunk and can get into his pod quietly, nobody knows, so nobody cares. Around 2008, the Japanese Supreme Court ruled that a pod hotel can be used for an address. The reason this was an issue is that some Japanese who were homeless had moved into their pod hotels, so they couldn't collect unemployment benefits. They couldn't get any kind of social support. They couldn't get on drug and alcohol treatment, which was a big issue at the time and still is. They couldn't even get a phone bill. Maybe we owe Newt Gingrich kind of an apology for his homeless for the computers for the homeless rant. Just a consideration. The Japanese Supreme Court said, no, actually, that's not going to work for us anymore. You will accept this as a legal address from now on. With that, we see a precedent for the use of homeless shelters and possibly reintegration into society. You can get on drug and alcohol treatment. You can get into job placement. You can get into all those social services that were cut off before. I'm particularly driven on the subject because I was homeless for a while out of the back of a station wagon. I know people who have died in part because they were homeless. Circumstances vary greatly. One became a homeless drug addict and finally just gave up his interest in fighting and overdosed. Know a couple of people who knew him very well, and I was told he intentionally used 4 times the amount of methamphetamine he'd ever tried before. This was not an accident. There's a case out of Seattle where a driver ran through a homeless camp and killed 4 and injured 6. When I first heard this story, my first instinct was that it was intentional. My second instinct was maybe she was drunk. With time, I realized I don't know either of these statements are true. Maybe she just made a mistake. I know I don't know, but for the circumstances, those circumstances exactly, but 4 are dead and 6 are injured entirely needlessly. That didn't have to happen. I know another case of a young woman who lost her battle to mental illness and diabetes, in part because she became homeless. I still talk to some of her friends and family, and that's an awkward conversation every time. In her case, I know there was so much more. I, for one, could have done more to help her. All of us could have done more to help her, but we couldn't even really isolate where she was half the time. I know we can do a whole lot better than what we've been doing so far. For you fiscally responsible types, we could actually make it self-funding and potentially profitable. Yes, we're going to have to drop a couple $1 million to build a pod home, but 90% of that money will come back within roughly 10 years. Firstly, the residents will be paying rent. I know $6 a night or $180 per month, which we will round up to $200 a month for easy math, isn't a whole lot individually, but multiply that by 100 and you get $20,000 a month. Multiply that by 10 months, and theoretically, in 10 months, theoretically, in a year or so, it's roughly $200,000. It would take 10 years to fully recoup the initial startup money, but think about this for a moment. First of all, that $2 million you would have been paying anyway in police and firefighter overtime, hospital bills, court and jail costs, etc. You'd be amazed how often homeless people intentionally try to get arrested just to be in jail overnight because it's going to be cold tonight. They don't want to be out in that cold. You would make up the majority of that $2 million in the first year alone for all of those social expenses that just disappear. And you've gotten roughly $250,000 back a year in rent. This would be an opportunity to try to recover some of those billions of dollars that have gone missing from hotel residency and other programs that were never meant to succeed. They were designed to fail from the outset. You know it, we know it, everybody knows it. Just nobody on either side of the aisle is really willing to address the problem or even uh, uh, talk about it honestly. Those hotel residencies were never a good idea. They were designed to fail from the outset. My vision for that very first pod home is about 100 veterans with preference to female veterans. I myself am a pre and post 9/11 veteran. The military has always been our social guinea pig. We have always tested a new social idea on our military and veterans first, so we're used to it. If anybody can make this work, veterans can make it work. And if it doesn't work, veterans can make it work. We can solve the problems. Once this first class of 100 graduate from living at the pod home, they will probably become the leadership for the first 100 or so pod homes. There are well more than 100 cities in the United States. Of course, the dream is that every pod home will eventually raise these people up to the point where the pod home itself shuts down. To this goal, I hope to make the pods modular so they can be taken from one pod home and installed in another miles away as trends change. I want to believe that the pod homes will actually put themselves out of business, and while this is never a complete possibility, we can definitely raise the conditions to the point where the vast majority of the 2 million people in Los Angeles Skid Row neighborhood alone who are homeless have reintegrated into society. They're tax paying, rent paying, apartment dwelling people. As a given pod home does shut down, the space could be converted to storage, possibly for profit. Some people just don't want to come out of the cold, and that's fine. That's the life they have chosen, and at some point, you have to let them live that life. We can raise the rest up. There will always be some who are there 10 to 20 years later, and we will deal with that. It may not always be pretty, all right, but we will deal with that. Residents that don't have an income may have to accept general assistance work projects, a major part of which is picking up cigarette butts off the side of the road. This is the life they will have to deal with, like I did for a while, but it is life again, and it is a place they want to be as opposed to a place nobody wants to be. I do not ask for money because you could give me $100 billion. It would just sit on a shelf somewhere. I'm not an architect. I'm not an engineer. I'm not even a licensed construction worker. I can't do anything to build a pod home. I would have to hire people to do it, and that $100 billion goes down very quickly when you have to hire people from the outside. Anyone claiming to be raising money on behalf of Pod Home should be reported. There are no authorized fundraising options For my project, there never will be. The only people who should ever be saying we're raising money for the pod home will be your local elected representatives. I'll be addressing that in a moment. Anybody else is probably a scam. People claiming to be collecting signatures for the elected representatives, that's one thing. People saying that we're raising money to build a pod home, something is wrong with that picture. I don't know necessarily what it is, but something is wrong with that picture. What I'm asking you for to do first is to share the page, the channel, and the videos with your friends and family and say, this is an idea. I think we should try it. And then go to your local elected officials and say it again. Don't go to your state and federal representatives. They can't really do anything to help at this level. They may even want to. They may be advocating this idea themselves back in their home district or cities. The state and federal legislatures really can't do much to build a pod home. Leave the state and federal officials to your local officials. They will turn to the state and feds and ask for the loans to build a pod home. All right. Some cities and counties will be able to build it entirely on their own. Good for them. Good for them. Most cities and counties don't have that kind of money lying around. Okay, fine. That's not a problem. Borrow the money from the state, borrow the money from the feds, repay it, build the pod homes, but keep it at the local level, especially for that administrative level, because you, the people, can watch your local officials a lot closer than you can your federal officials. They're your next door neighbors. You can go to City Hall and say, or county supervisors and say, hey, what happened to the $2 billion that you borrowed from the feds to eradicate this homeless problem? And it's worse than before. Keep it to your local level. Pod homes can only be effectively built and managed at the local level. They are the ones who can step forward and say, we want to try this in our city. We can do a lot better, barest minimum effort. And we need to start doing something before we create another crisis. Thank you for your time.